Now, we're now being joined by economists and an analyst, an industrialist as well, Henry Boyo. You're welcome to TVC Breakfast.
Thank you, Mike.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Now, first of all, let's have a picture of how the inflation rate is calculated to the understanding of every other person generally who is not an economist.
Well, that might not help you as much as how inflation comes about.
Okay.
You find that even the secondary school certificate holder is aware that inflation is generally defined as too much money chasing too few goods. So you find that invariably, wherever there is inflation, it means that the volume of money supply in the system is running ahead of productivity. So if you want to eliminate inflation, you have to bring the two in balance. In the case of our country, and indeed in the case of most African countries, you would find that there is a huge disconnect between the volume of money supply as well as the productivity of each country. This is particularly evident in our situation, where the CBN has endlessly been mopping up surplus naira from the system. The reason why the CBN is willing to pay up to 10, 11 or 12% in order to borrow money it does not need, only to warehouse those funds as idle, is because if the volume of money in the system is not controlled, inflation will probably run out of control, and you could easily be talking of anything like 20% rate of inflation. What is not often clear is that if inflation is even running at just 10%, it means every 5 years or so, anybody having static incomes, for example, the 18,000 naira minimum wage earner, would suddenly find after 5 years that he has lost 50% of the purchasing power of his income, and that's very bad. Not only does it turn that person into a poorer person, it also has, how would I say, a collateral impact on productivity itself, because if there is nobody buying your bread, you don't have to produce bread. And particularly also, if you have to borrow 20%, at 20% in order to produce your bread, and there's nobody buying it or nobody who has the purchasing power to buy it, you also pack up and reduce the number of people that you employ. So there is a chain link between inflation, poverty, and the level of unemployment we have in the system.
Okay, perhaps that's why some economists have suggested that the issue of inflation in Nigeria is perennially artificial, because the consumer price index is never really well calculated, isn't it?
Well, I don't know about artificiality or whatever. What is clear is that if you should go into the market, particularly housewives, when they go into the market, they suddenly find that they are buying less and less with the housekeeping money that they are given. I think that is the critical aspect. You could debate how it is calculated from here till eternity, and you'll still find people who would have various inclinations or views. But what is clear is that when you go into the market, you find that your money is becoming worthless and worthless. For example, like what happened in Zimbabwe, they totally lost control of money supply, and ultimately you had a situation where $1 was going for about 1 billion Zimbabwe shillings or dollars. So we have to be very careful. We have to watch inflation. But at the end of the day, I think the critical thing is how do we stop it?
Okay. Now, some time ago, economist Professor Pat Tomi made a statement saying that sometimes inflation is healthy for the economy. If that is economics as the case may be, what context of inflation can be healthy for the economy?
Let's put this in context. To a very large extent, unfortunately, as Africans, we tend to, we have aspirations to be like the first world. In other words, to enjoy the same level of, how would I say, economic growth as the first world. But we are not willing to subject ourselves to the discipline of maintaining those indices that drive those successful economies we emulate. We want to be eagles, but we want to compare our indices with doves. In successful economies everywhere, inflation is usually not more than 1 or 2%. I think in the UK at the moment, inflation is probably less than 1% or something like that. That is a serious-minded economy because, as I've said, if inflation is up to 10%, we're talking 12%, it means that your people will get poorer very gradually over a period of time. So you find that if you are unable to control money supply, invariably you would have inflation. But to answer your question with regards to what is good inflation, if inflation is, for example, minimal and there is no, how would I say it, demand, there's no consumer demand, because you must have the economic activity that would determine whether or not there's inflation vis-a-vis the amount of money supply that is available. So if you have a situation where the economy is not moving, you might do certain things to instigate inflation so as to be able to ginger up productivity within the economy. But in our situation, we should not be talking about that type of situation, because we are totally on the opposite side of it. We are neck deep in inflation, and our people are getting poorer.
All right, we have economist Ken Ife on Skype from Abuja. Many thanks for joining the conversation this morning on TVC Breakfast. We're talking, of course, about the rise in inflation in Nigeria. And according to the CBN governor, the cause of this particular rise is not due to too much money in circulation. It says it has to do with structural factors. Do you agree with him?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Well, that is one side of the story. There's obviously no doubt that Nigeria's economy is undergoing immense structural change, because we just have to tackle with moving from an import-dependent economy to a much more balanced economy through a diversification strategy, and I'm still waiting to see what that strategy is and how we're going to push through that. But of course, the other part of the restructuring agenda is to attack the demand side that is asking for $4.66 billion when you're only getting $1 billion, to see if you can stem that demand and do an import substitution strategy, which would fundamentally restructure. But that is an argument for another day. I haven't seen serious action in those directions. But to connect to what my colleague has been saying, there is a supply, there's a demand pool and supply push factors on inflation. We know that there is a lot more to do with, it's not surplus of money in circulation as much as shortage of goods that are available, because shortage of goods could cause inflation and excess money supply could cause inflation. In this case, the demand in the economy is not being met. People are losing their jobs, there's contraction in the economy, and this is dangerous because if the economy is contracting, which is recession, you have to increase type of expenditure from government and all those works and capital projects to bring more.
All right, Ken, thank you. We'll come back to this. Now, let's see a graphical representation of what these figures are and how they translate in true terms. Now, generally, of course, it stands at 12.8%, and that's considered the highest level in nearly 4 years. Analysts say that it is due to low oil prices and currency controls introduced by the central bank. Now, our guest in the studio said this, certainly there's a lot of money in circulation. Those are certainly different economic indices generally. Now, let's go down memory lane. Nigeria's inflation rate remained fairly steady, ranging between 9.3% to 9.6%. And that figure was maintained between October 2015 to January 2016, generally. And then it finally hit its worst record in February 2016, standing at 11.4%. Now, going further, from 11.4%, there is now a sharp rise to 12.8% in March 2016. And we are in April now, and it has remained steady. What do you make of all of this breakdown from everything we are seeing? Now, if I have to come to Henry here, the issues of the forces, the market forces, demand and supply being in control of the market is something some analysts have also put forward. Why would that not be healthy for a Nigerian situation, for instance?
There's nothing wrong with the principle of demand and supply, and it operates within a market system in order to be able to allocate resources effectively. But unfortunately, you will find that in the market, market for petrol, for example, and also market for money in Nigeria, the market is supposed to determine its own prices, but unfortunately, the interference from government agencies often disrupt and distort the expectations of Nigeria for better results.
All right, let's talk about the issue of food, a sub-index of this inflation, particularly that of food inflation. Why do you think that is on the rise? Because the chunk of the rise now goes to the food sub-index. Why is that?
Well, I think that is easy enough. I mean, it is clear that we have a very large population of 170 million, and it's growing. But unfortunately, we are not feeding ourselves. Not because we are not capable, but because the structures are not in place to encourage farmers to produce more. For example, even though you have been told of many agricultural intervention funds which have been made available to the sector, Nigerians are yet to see the actual benefit, probably because the intervention funds themselves were totally counterproductive, because you have a situation where the agency that controls money supply in your country readily admits that I have a problem with liquidity, such that I am prepared to borrow at 10, 11, 12% money that I don't need and warehouse that money, then you must be certain that there is crisis in the hands of the regulator of the banking system, which is the central bank. So if they themselves admit we have to do something so silly and so counterproductive, especially when the real sector is saying we don't have funds to invest, and yet you are prepared to borrow money you don't need at 10, 11 or 12% in order to control money supply, in order to halt inflation. So you find that there is a contradiction between the expectations of Nigerians and the product of the policies of the CBN, particularly with regards to the creation of Naira supply within the system. Okay. This is what drives the agricultural sector. This is what drives the mining sector. This is what drives economy and industry in general.
All right, now let's take a look at the African going beyond Nigeria. Now, Nigeria is not left alone in this, as Angola's inflation rate has also risen to 23.6% year-on-year from 20.3% in February. Now, the Bureau of Statistics said this comes on the back of rising healthcare, food and drink prices generally. And then we have all of that. You have the comparison there. Now, Ghana is also battling with inflation rise, as the West African country's annual consumer price inflation rose to 19.2% in March from 18.5% in February. Now, the West African country is implementing a 3-year aid program with the International Monetary Fund in an attempt to remedy fiscal problems, including inflation persistently above government targets. Now, going further there, certainly Ghana seemed to have a blueprint to tackle this. And people will ask, how about Nigeria? The partnership with the International Monetary Fund is something that Nigerians usually become very emotional about. What's your reaction to this in this partnership?
I'm surprised that you say Ghana has a blueprint we should even look at. It's unfortunate you said that, because you find that you cannot use as a point of superior reference a country which mops up excess liquidity with 25% interest rate. I mean, that's crazy. What then do you expect the real sector to borrow at? 40-something%? And you use that as a country of reference? Don't do that. In Nigeria, we are even...
Well, we're just taking a look at...
Yes, but don't make a reference to something that is inferior to yourself, and as if to say it's, you know. In the Nigerian situation, we are also beating the same path. We are borrowing money we don't need, or the government is borrowing money, the CBN is borrowing money it doesn't need at 12, 11% or whatever. At the same time, the liquidity surplus remains uncontrollable. So you continue to have these headwinds of money supply driving your inflation to levels which are uncomfortable for economic growth, driving your cost of funds beyond levels that are supportive of industrial growth, and also driving your exchange rate to levels which are totally inconsistent with the amount of foreign exchange you are earning.
Okay, we still have our guest in Abuja via Skype, Mr. Ken Ife. Can you please react to what my colleague Joe said now? In comparison, Nigeria and some other African countries, are we doing that badly